First Nations, you have to realize, hold the key to the Canadian economy. They are the ones who can unlock it and move it forward.
Hello, I'm Stuart McNish, and you're listening to Conversations Live. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series addressing the big issues of our time. For each episode, we bring together subject matter experts for a deep conversation designed to provide you with information that helps you make more informed decisions. I hope you enjoy it.
Today, we come to you from Kemkemale, the land of many maples. These are the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, who have lived on and continue to call these lands home. These are also the lands throughout British Columbia that are the traditional territories of over 202 First Nations and communities. Nations that can and will play a vital role in addressing the economic challenges BC faces today, both internal and external. We have regulatory and approval processes that at times thwart, stall, or even kill investments. We're constricted by interprovincial trade barriers, and we have a changing relationship with the United States and with other nations that are looking to us to ease their changing status as trading partners with the United States. Today, our objective is to work towards an understanding of the central role First Nations will have as we establish the path forward for all who wish to invest in British Columbia. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series that seeks to advance our understanding of the big issues of our times. Our goal is to share ideas and insights that help each of us gain a greater understanding of our communities, our province, and our country. There are many organizations that help us host Conversations Live. We're only able to bring these events to you in person and live online thanks to organizations that support programming for engaged citizens. You'll see the names and logos of these organizations scroll across the screen throughout this morning. I can't thank them enough, and that's why I'm going to call out each and every one of them to say thank you. Our hosting sponsors are RBC, KPMG, and Macmillan LLP. Our annual sponsors are Digital, BD Developments, Polygon, Stem Cell Technologies, Helijet, Rennie & Co., Pacific Salmon Foundation, TC Energy, Fortis BC, TELUS, and Marquee Wines, which are contributing gift certificates to each of our participants. So you can look for that gift certificate to each of our panelists. And our supporting sponsors are BCIT, Falkirk, the Goodman Report, OPI, DeSaco Mines, and the Indigenous Partner Success Showcase, where on October the 13th, we'll include a special Conversations Live panel. And we work in association with Mario Canseco, a research co. Our media partner is the Vancouver Sun, which is live streaming us right now, and those live streaming services are provided by Oh Boy Productions. As I say, without their generous support, this program would not be possible. Now, one last bit of business before we get started. For anyone, whether you're in person or online and you wish to submit a question, please go to slido.com, enter the code Conversations Live, and then send in your question. I'll receive your questions and share them with the panelists where I can. That said, I may not deliver your question verbatim, but I will be motivated, however, by your thoughts and ideas, and they'll help to shape some of my questions this morning. Our topic today is focused on why engagement with First Nations in the development of natural resource and infrastructure projects is required. It is a must. As stated in the Haida decision and in Section 35 of the Constitution, First Nations must be consulted and accommodated. Therefore, how do we move forward in a way that ensures all parties have access to opportunities that benefits communities, the environment, and the provincial economy? And is this requirement a positive or a negative to potential investors? This is a question that we're going to ask. We have a remarkable panel of experts. Crystal Smith, past Chief Haisla Nation. Mark Magnacca, the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit in the UK. He's joining us virtually. JP Gladu, Mokwateh. Glen Clark, Chair of BC Hydro. And Dallas Smith, Nanakwales Council and finally Mike McPhie, Falkirk. Now, just before we start, we asked Mario Canseco of Research Co. to conduct a poll on our thoughts on this topic in relationship to where we are economically in the province of British Columbia right now. Arav, can you please roll that video?
As Canadians await the list of nation-building projects that the federal government under Prime Minister Mark Carney is supposed to undertake, the feelings of BC residents are clear. In spite of the province emerging from two remarkably close elections in 2024 and 2025, there is consensus about the need to move swiftly. More than 4 in 5 BC residents want to play a role in getting new ideas to the next stage. In the summer, we saw provincial governments, particularly in BC, Manitoba, and Ontario, entice residents to buy local products. This is an especially complex matter in industries currently dominated by American-made and processed goods. In our survey, 84% of BC residents want the provincial government to build a more self-sufficient economy that is less dependent on the United States. The erratic presidency of Donald Trump in the United States has had a deep effect on the perceptions of British Columbians on resource development. Our province is no longer regarded as a place where regulatory frameworks and shifting public opinion stifle economic growth. At this point, almost 3 in 4 BC residents tell us that the economic uncertainty that the current American government has created makes them more open to ensure that pending projects are authorized. In spite of the urgency that BC residents outline about the economic state of affairs, there is a high level of support for respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and their leaders. Just over 7 in 10 BC residents want meaningful consultation to remain a priority for resource projects. Only 1 in 5 BC residents think the federal and BC governments should do as they please without properly consulting with First Nations. By a margin larger than 2 to 1, BC residents believe that any project that is established on a First Nations territory requires the consent of its inhabitants. Even at a time of increased economic indecision, British Columbians believe long-standing practices related to engagement and consent should continue to be observed. For Conversations Live, I'm Mario Canseco from Research Co.
Thank you, Mario. You know, I just got a message in from Spain saying we're watching live online right now and we're keen to understand the investment landscape here in British Columbia. And Crystal, I want to start with you, and I know I give you a heads up on this. When we take a look back over the last 10 to 12 years, you played an instrumental role in helping to ensure that the LNG Canada project came into being, and you played a fundamental role in the moving forward with your LNG project as well. If you take a look at the landscape today versus when you first started, how do you describe what's changed?
I would describe it as less stress for me. It is absolutely inspiring to see that British Columbians and Canadians are taking a different perspective when it comes to natural resource development here in our province and our country. At the time that we were making the push and truly investing our time, our effort, and our focus as a nation, pushing LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink forward at a time where LNG was a horrible word to even say in our province, and going against the grain and public opinion because our community, and I appreciate the thought of me being instrumental, but it wasn't me. It was my community. It was our membership, and we've got 2,000 members that are in our community, and that number's constantly growing. Without their support, without their mandate, without their vision in terms of what their expectations were about participating in our local economy, I would not have had the inspiration and the drive to do what we were ultimately accomplishing. But it is absolutely great. I actually, near the end of my term, I did a interview with my good friend Brent Jang at Global Mail, and he had asked me this question, and I told him the first part of my response is off the record. But I honestly thanked Donald Trump. And as odd as that may sound, it was because I was hearing the narrative shift, the thought process that we can become more independent, we can become a stronger province and a stronger country. Because when we aren't strong, it's our communities that suffer even more. You know, we think about where our living standards are in each of our communities right now with the economy the way it is. And if that worsens, the job for leadership to provide opportunity gets much harder. So it is great to see the shift. It's great to hear that British Columbians are becoming more and more support, but it's also great to see that the thought process around the respect for Indigenous rights holders is prevailing amongst majority of British Columbians as well.
So that is a public perception shift. Dallas, from your perspective, what's changing from a government to government or a legislative perspective that now says moving forward we have a clearer path? Or do we?
Well, I think we do. I think we need to illustrate that path more. I think the breadcrumbs that some of us left for others to follow need to be recharged, because we've been doing this work since the Great Bear Rainforest, since all the standoffs about natural resource development. First Nations have stood up and taken more of a leadership role, and I think that's part of the process. Is we need to know what we want so we can work with both the provincial and federal governments to make that happen. And I think that's something that gets lost in the partisan challenges that we live in right now, both in British Columbia and Canada. So it's really up to First Nations to really set where that bar should be, but defend it and be accountable to it. I think that's one of the things that we've seen change is First Nations have become more, they have more capacity and they have more drive to achieve these visions, and people start to get on the bus with us as opposed to worrying about who should be on it, who shouldn't be on it. We're actually driving the bus and people are comfortable getting on it now.
You know, Mark, I see you nodding there in London. Your thoughts on what Dallas and Crystal have been saying?
I think it's a very significant change in the perception of the people of the population of British Columbia. And I think as important as those perceptions changed, it's going to take time to change overseas perceptions. Because what has come out for the recent past, if people think of Canada and Indigenous people, over the past 5 or 10 years, it's demonstrations, it's blockades, if Canada registers at all. And there was some interesting research that came out from Public Policy Group, which I think is even more overwhelming, which talks about how Canada's been at the bottom of the list in terms of GDP growth, construction approvals, time to build. And with working with Indigenous peoples, it's now clear, and there's case studies. Cedar LNG is a great example, as are the other success stories. By working in partnership, you will actually get your project done on time.
Glen, when we take a look at the latest moves by BC Hydro to add new power, I mean, where were those projects? They were all on First Nations territory. Why was it so important that you moved there so rapidly?
Well, I think to do any major economic project, probably in the Western world, really, you need social license. And in British Columbia, to get that social license, you need to partner with First Nations. That's the key to expediting development. And when we did the power call, a second power call, you know, we put some. What's really interesting is we said there had to be Aboriginal partnerships. But we didn't say how much. But they all came in at 51% First Nations. And that wasn't directed by BC Hydro. That came through the process. And you know, we do think that particularly in rural areas where there are limited economic opportunities, using these natural resources with First Nations is a terrific sort of wealth transfer to First Nations for the use of the territory. So we think there's a lot of capacity building, a lot of opportunities, but more importantly, the social license to actually get things done flows through the First Nations participation.
JP, on that thought, I mean, Glen's right, isn't he? This is how we move forward in
absolutely.
Canada. Yeah.
I'm an Anishinaabe from Northern Ontario. I live in my community of Sandpoint First Nation, and it's great to see BC Hydro catching up to us in Ontario. Our communities have been equity shareholders in many generation projects and transmission projects. Certainly Ontario doesn't have it right across the board, but if we look across this country, and amazing leadership of this incredible woman to my left, and the Enbridge projects, we've got plenty of examples in this country now where equity has come to the table, where big business and procurement opportunities. There's billions of dollars of projects that are being implemented every year. Fisheries on the East Coast, communities taking leadership over our territories and doing it in a way that is respectful of the land, but also driving economy, not only for our communities, but sometimes actually being the main employer in some regions when you talk to people like Chief Terrence Paul and former Chief my good friend Crystal Smith. So we know how to do, there's plenty of opportunities to get this right. So we've got to get past this notion as Dallas is saying, like, there is a path forward. We got to illustrate it a little. We got to color deeper colors to make sure that the world knows, and that Indigenous people, when it's done right, we can actually lead. And so we need to stop looking at Indigenous people and communities as hurdles, but rather the economic spearhead, the actual competitive edge when we get these relationships right.
Mike, you have said that investment needs to have confidence that projects will move forward. There's a question that just came in that said, how can partnering with First Nations help to de-risk projects?
Thanks for the question, Stu, and real honor to be up here with such an august group of leaders that have really made things happen in this space. It's really interesting. Someone said we were talking just before this started about, and what Chief Smith said about Donald Trump coming in. One of the things that I think has happened at British Columbia is we've been shaken out of our kind of comfort zone of attracting investment, and one of some of the work that we do in our company is foreign direct investment, and it's super interesting because you see companies that, it's a big world out there. We're a small place. We think we're super important, but we're pretty small, right, in comparison to what's happening on the global stage. But there's a lot of people that are interested in British Columbia and investing. And I'll say, without just restating what's been said here, partnerships is the place to begin. I've been involved in that a long time for myself and had tremendous fortune of being part of building some of those partnerships. But the thing is, we need to work as a jurisdiction, both British Columbia and Canada, in helping the world that foreign direct investment understand and support that partnership development. It is because many of these big projects, LNG Canada and others, they're significant, but not all projects are that big. And folks struggle with understanding, what does partnership mean? How is it going to be applied on the ground? And I think it was Warren Buffett who said, the best thing to invest in is yourself. And I think we can do, as a jurisdiction, a little bit better job of how we curate incoming investment. And I'll just give a quick example. If you go to the US and you're interested in investing, whatever it is that you're doing, and you go into a state, and Glen was saying this earlier, the governor will call you. If you're making an investment, the government will call you and say, how can we work our system to help support you to make this investment? I was working on a project where we went into Georgia, and the whole thing was laid out for us, from training to property tax abatement to investments to making relationships with the business community within that area. In British Columbia, similarly, I don't think we're doing that. I think when people come and look and they say, oh, this is great, but we don't curate investment coming in. Quebec has Investissement Quebec, who has hundreds of people that are just focused on curating internal investment, and they help unlock and impede the pathways to investment, because to get to FID, as most folks that have been involved in major projects, it is tough. It is investment committees, boards of directors, all these things, and they're making generational investments. And so as a jurisdiction, I think we have to stop looking at our sunshine and mountains and our beautiful seas that are around us and be proud of the best place we live in, because we're so fortunate, but understand that the world is a competitive place. to get those dollars coming in and creating the opportunity, we really have to focus in on what are the fundamental things we can do, and helping companies understand and maybe do a bit more matchmaking of Indigenous businesses with those incoming foreign direct investment, and help folks to map that out. Because if we can do that, the opportunity that we can unravel here, I think, is pretty extraordinary.
So JP and Crystal, because you've both been appointed now to the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on major projects, how do we start to create that kind of environment?
How do we? Well, it starts with forums like this as well. Stu, thanks so much for bringing this table together. When it gets to projects, and where's my buddy Ben? He's in the office. He brought us over to the UK a few years ago to actually meet with the investors, meet with mining companies around critical minerals. So the big part of this is the education piece. So that when we come to a table around projects, that you've got Indigenous leaders, you've got the investors, you've got the proponents, you get everybody on the same page as far as what the vision and the goal is. And Mike, you're absolutely right. You know, I sit on a couple of publicly traded boards, and directors are, we hold our CEOs and our executives accountable to make sure that they're driving value for our shareholders. So there's a lot of complexity. And if we don't see the value in projects where we're going to invest our capital, because capital is everything, what we do with it, including the relationships with Indigenous people at the table every step of the way, we're going to be reticent to actually start investing, because we know that is a major risk. So building these tables, and I don't want to speak for Chris, but it's an incredible honor, but it's going to be a lot of work for us. And there's 9 other Indigenous leaders across the country that we've got to know over the years, and I think kudos to Prime Minister Carney and Don Farrell and the Major Projects Office to create this space. Got off to a rocky start with Bill C5 and here in BC. These things, but it's going to take courage as well to step into these places, because it's not going to be easy.
No, it definitely is, and I look at that list and think about the sheer amount of horsepower that's behind the 11 people that have been chosen, and what a great honor it is to be there. The difference in terms of my experience as the former chief councillor, and it's been interesting these last few months where I've been actually able to take a breath and kind of reflect back to what was accomplished in the 12 years that I was a part of our leadership. And now that I reflect back, our push for LNG Canada, I don't know if that project would have happened if there wasn't the Indigenous support that was behind it. The constant lobbying, and when true partnerships formed, we can be your biggest ally. And when I'm talking about biggest ally, we've got our rights and title behind us. We've got strength of how many court cases behind our leadership, and how we're able to navigate those conversations in terms of what we want happening in our territories comes with so much strength. And I'm talking about the conversations that I had with leadership in me traveling back to Ottawa in a consistent manner in terms of what LNG Canada, Coastal GasLink meant to our communities. And to be able to see that come to fruition. And then on to Cedar, where, the Indigenous leadership, we were the ones that brought the project in terms of the technology, how it was going to be built, where it was going to be built. We brought that to proponents. We baked that and said, come join us, come on the bus with us. And we drove that. Every decision-making opportunity, we were equal partners at the governance table. We were equal partners in the equity. But that was something that our community wanted to see. And if you have that at that level where we were completely invested, not only our leadership, but our membership were completely invested. And when I talk about our membership being invested, we needed their approval in order to get the equity. And they voted 93% in favor of that equity. And that was absolutely probably the most stressful time. One of the most stressful times in my leadership was to get that response back waiting for that response back from our membership. But spoke volumes in terms of their support. So if you have those drivers in front, de-risking every aspect. You've got a community leading, and many court cases of rights and title behind you.
Glen?
First of all, there's zero chance that LNG would have happened without the Haisla. Zero. I mean, let's be honest. So
Exactly.
full credit to you and other First Nations that were involved. My old boss, Jimmy Pattison, used to say, capital's a coward. It goes where it's easy, and it doesn't go where it's hard. And that's been a challenge for British Columbia, I think, because I think, especially for foreign investors, it's challenging. And I think what we're seeing now, and I think for the first time really, is the partnership with First Nations makes it easier. And I think that's really...
Not easy, but easier.
Not easy. Well, look at these big projects. Doesn't matter if there was no First Nations. These are hard projects to do, so we're not kidding ourselves. But we have these resources here. We have this opportunity here. And now with partnerships of First Nations, we are de-risking it. We're making it easier. Not easy, but easier. And I think that message is strong. I think as Mike made this point, I don't think we, as a province, are aggressive enough at pursuing these opportunities that are here in British Columbia. We're too passive. And in the United States, it's very true. You go to the United States, you have a welcoming, aggressive government trying to promote economic development in their jurisdiction. We're just a bit too passive, I think, here. And First Nations are leading the way, but we need everybody to be much more aggressive in pursuing these initiatives faster, quicker, in partnership with First Nations. And we have this little window. I mean, I've been around politics a long time. I guess I've been around a long time. And I've never seen public opinion change this fast. And so we have this window where the public is on side, First Nations are on side, private capital is looking, the federal government's on side, the provincial government's on side. We just need to drive that home, because I think with success breeds more success. And that's why we're seeing LNG 2 on the major projects list, because LNG 1 happened. That's why we're seeing Silisms approved yesterday, because Cedar happened. And I think there's a bit of momentum being built, and we just need to drive through it, I think, to make it happen.
We'll get to the Silisms approval in a moment. But Mark, when you're listening to where we're at right now, does the lack of a playbook on how to invest in British Columbia and in Canada in working with First Nations, are we moving in the right direction right now, and how important is that? Or do we recognize, okay, the playbook can come, what's most important is building relationships first?
Well, I think it's very clear. I don't think the issue is First Nations. I think when people hear the story at our summit, we had the largest gathering of Indigenous leaders in probably 300 years in London. And the investors and asset managers, corporates who were there listening to the stories, they get working with Indigenous partners will make it easier. The bigger challenge that Canada has thought of is, first of all, I think it was mentioned earlier, it's very comfortable in BC, as it is in a lot of the country. We're very fortunate to be in a country called Canada. And this need to compete more aggressively is very important. What really needs the window is working through the provincial and federal legislation and regulations, because that's what's holding the country back. It's not the First Nations. They're there to be partners, as demonstrated with the different case studies we've been talking about, and the thinking and the support from the population. It's where's the playbook to make it through all these. You show up and want to talk to Canada, who do you talk to? The federal government, the provincial government? It's a complicated place if you don't grow up in Canada.
So, Dallas, you are aware, and Glen alluded to it, that yesterday afternoon the Environmental Assessment Office here in British Columbia gave the go-ahead to the Silisms LNG project, and the feds followed suit this morning. When you start to take a look at the way in which they have laid out the process moving forward, that it streamlines environmental processes, are we starting to build that playbook?
I really think we are. When we talk about streamlining processes, it doesn't mean we're getting rid of the regulatory regimes that are in there. First Nations have done so much spatial planning around what needs to be protected. They understand where there's opportunity to develop, and they're ready to have those discussions now. Let's look at Fairy Creek as an example. We've got protesters blocking a First Nations from being able to develop own source revenue in their own territories. And so we really need to stand together as First Nations and support the direction that those communities are going in. And that's really got to become part of the playbook. There's got to be more of an understanding about the role First Nations play in this. While a First Nations government is a regulator, our economic development companies are proponents. You know, we're investors, we're equity shareholders now, and people need to understand that we have the capacity to play all those roles now. We have the legislation, we have the litigation behind us to power that. And so instead of talking about should we or shouldn't be, it's where should we be doing it, and how should we be doing it, and how do we continue to put the principles of First Nations sustainability front and center in that while we're streamlining regulatory processes to achieve a goal.
So, Mike, similar question to you about the processes that the Environmental Assessment Office bring now to proponents as they move forward. How does this help move projects forward? But let's also just throw in a little bit of a wrinkle. It's not all major projects that are moving forward. There's smaller nations and smaller projects. Both the proponent and the First Nations may need financial assistance. How important is that be considered?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Stu. I think, you know, it's interesting. There's a narrative that I think generally exists that it takes 10 or 15 years to get a major project approved. And so the real definition of the Major Projects Office is like to take that on. Let's speed that up and let's get projects approved. My experience, and because we do a lot of work in this space, is that hasn't actually been the case. So you can get projects through quite a bit quicker, even on existing legislation. And it's just one part of the process. Now, there's no doubt the argument of better coordination between federal, provincial, and related governments is needed, and I think that's a big part of Don Farrell and the major projects are going to look at that. But if you look at the case studies over the last 5 or 10 years, if you have a partnership with an Indigenous community and you're able to present a united front, that you build the trust. You know, we have a bit of a saying in our work that you kind of move at the speed of trust. If you have taken the time where proponents sit and actively listen to communities about what their concerns are and then reflect, not design a project, then announce it and seek to consult, but actually sit down and say, look, okay, we have this idea. What do you think about it? Can we do this together? If you start in that place, and I presume that's part of maybe what happened in the case of LNG Canada. If you can do that and you come forward with a united message to government, you're making the job easy for government. So I'm just offering that pathway has actually been set and you can move it forward. But this question of approval leading to investment, that's not the only thing. You know, the trust goes a couple of ways. It's trust of that making that final investment decision, that FID that we all talk about, which again is not easy. The proponent needs to have trust that the policy framework that they're operating within, whether it's taxation, the way Glen's going to keep electricity rates low in the province and keep it as our competitive advantage, that those sort of fundamental aspects of what we're doing as a province and as a jurisdiction are going to remain, because those are our competitive advantages. And so at the end of the day, it isn't all LNG Canada. There's a whole bunch of smaller and medium-sized projects that are moving forward that collectively make up a big part of our economy. And I think we need to be mindful of that we can't just focus on the 5 biggest ones. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on that's fundamental to supporting our overall well-being.
So one of the other elements, of course, is giving overall oversight and resource management to First Nations. You know, Dallas and JP, in forestry, you both have experiences that have demonstrated that when that oversight and management is given to the local First Nation, there's benefits for all. Maybe you can share both of your experiences.
Thanks, brother. Before I go there, and it leads into it, I just want to pick up on Mike's stream of conscious as well as Glen's. When we think about, you know, there's a lot of smart engineers out there that can engineer the heck out of it. It's difficult, like you said, Glen. But when I look at proponents coming into projects, they invest all the resources and time and human capital and engineers, and then they put this much of their budget towards the Indigenous relations. I'm going, that's the hardest part of your work now. Why are you not investing the time and resources, financial resources, to make sure you've got all this so you can get through the regulatory? So word of advice to anybody working, invest significant time and resources in building that trust and working with communities, hire Indigenous people, hire Indigenous firms and our allies to help you do the work. I'm a forester by training. My grandfather was a forester, my logger, my dad was a logger. In 2008, I was part of the negotiating team for my First Nation and a number of others when we had the first forestry crisis. And the company was folding up. Our First Nations went from 0% management control to 100% management control of the Lake Nipigon forest. First of its kind in the country, I believe, for such a big, million cubic meters of cut. And there's this fear that, oh no, the First Nations are taking over the land. We've always had land for thousands of years. What do you mean we're taking over the land? We know how to manage our territories. And since 2008, we've managed the forest better than any other forestry company has. We've gotten just as much volume out in a more effective way that respects our rights. I was just stalking moose the other 2 days ago. These aren't, William, these aren't my hunting attire, but we have a great system. We have a sawmill in our community, and now we have a gasification project that got FID and is going to be ready in the spring. We're going to be producing energy and biochar and gas from our resources that we manage, our logging companies, our forest management. We've done it better than anybody else has done in history. This reluctance to turn over control back to our communities has to go away. We know our lands. Nobody knows our lands better than we do, too. A lot of what, and this is probably a great segue into Dallas.
I love the bump set spike we've done over the years. I go back to the days of, again, the war in the woods, where environmentalists and forest companies were fighting over our territories, and we were really just observers. I was just teasing Glen. That's when I first met him during the early days of the Great Bear Rainforest.
We didn't put you in jail, did we?
Yeah, no, not yet, not yet. I was a quicker runner than my uncle. But in all seriousness, we watched for years while people were carving up our territories and trying to protect our territories with green blobs or red blobs, and they're doing our self-determination to where we finally stood up and said, enough's enough. We're doing our own spatial planning. We're using the principles that have sustained us for 14,000 years, but we can take that to a corporate vision now. And so we started dealing with Crown land referrals. We always hear permits, permits are being held up by reconciliation. Well, that's not really the case. In the two most successful cuts on Vancouver Island, they're in partnerships with First Nations, and we actually get our whole 880,000 cubic meters out because we built that relationship and have that trust, and we have a common vision at the end of the day, so we're able to keep things moving and keep people working, except when the union's on strike, but maybe that'll be a next panel discussion. But you can
address that issue as well, can you?
Well, it's important. I mean, the labor force is an important part of the equation that we're dealing with, and as First Nations are taking the role, we're taking all that on. We're understanding what is the role of labor, what is the role of communities. But like I said in the beginning, we're driving the bus now, and we're seeing results. We're seeing those results start to become evident that First Nations taking control of the management and development of natural resources is a good step towards reconciliation. Not only because it creates jobs and certainty and all those things, but all those investment dollars stay in the community. This isn't about shareholders and all those things. Shareholders are expensive. Sorry for publicly traded companies. They are important because they bring that capital that's so important. But we're starting to redistribute that capital that's taking on social problems, addiction problems, health problems, and all those sorts of things. So it's really starting to close the circle on why we're doing these things. And I'm really appreciative that Prime Minister Carney's had the courage to put First Nations in a position to help lead this discussion even further.
I want to make note of the fact that just recently West Fraser, the Lake Babine First Nation, and the province all came together to extend governance of the forestry license in the Lake Babine Nation to more than 38% now. And this is having a fundamental impact, positive impact on West Fraser's decision to stay in the area at a time when our forest industry is in distress. I have an interesting question here. Meaningful reconciliation has many facets, and Glen, I'm going to go to you first, though. One challenge for nations, community, and projects with over 202 nations in British Columbia, and many of them overlap. Can nations, government, and industry together support this territorial clarity to enable self-determination for all? I mean, it's a complicated
Easy question.
Yeah.
No, it's a tough question. It really is a tough. The overlap issue is a vexing one, to be honest. Even I was involved, of course, in the first Nisga'a Treaty, and of course that went to court. I think the Gitsan challenged it. So I won't tell you what the Chief Gosnell said, but you can imagine. But no, the overlap issue is a real one. I do think it's a messy time. I think we be candid here. This last 10 years has been a bit messy as we work through this change. And I just feel optimistic that we're kind of coming out of that messy period, and through leadership from First Nations and government and some businesses, we're starting to see the rules of the game kind of get clarified. And that is an essential prerequisite for investment. And the overlap issues, I mean, we have some now. We awarded wind farm licenses to 2 First Nations who are being challenged by the adjacent First Nation for conflicts. So, I mean, I'm not sure you can get around that in British Columbia, quite candidly. I think that's going to take some time. First Nations have developed different, as you tell me better than I can, sort of arbitration kind of rights or ways of solving those disputes, which is starting again. You're starting to see that traction amongst First Nations working together to kind of solve them. But I do think that's something it's going to be very challenging to go through. Let me just be positive about one thing. I think there's not been enough tripartite discussion. First Nations, business, government, actually sitting down trying to solve it. There's a lot of nation-to-nation issues that have left out industry and unions. There's been a lot of one-off deals here and there. And so I do think it would behoove governments to have a more involvement of the parties, all the parties. We want to accomplish First Nations reconciliation. We also want to have an industrial economy that works, that creates good union jobs on this side. And I think that as this messy period goes through, there's been some progress on this side, left out this side. And so I think there's a bit of work to be done there. It's happening anyway. It's being clarified anyway, but I think there's an opportunity right now, this little window, again, as Crystal said, Trump, this is a window where I think people are more receptive to trying to drive home and really bring some tripartite or even more than that discussions around how we can move forward.
Mike, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I fully endorse what Glen has just said. I mean, there's been some big policy shifts provincially over the last few years, like significant. If you're on the mining side, the changes of the Mineral Tenure Act, some of the stuff that's being discussed right now with the Heritage Resources Act, other changes that are made, and my criticism, I think, of government is it may be well intentioned, but it's kind of like, okay, it's sort of like what industry used to do. We'd go and design a project and then announce it and ask people what they thought. It doesn't work that way. It was sort of like what I was trying to say is you build trust by sitting and talking and listening, active listening. Okay, what are your concerns? Because the concerns are all legitimate. The concerns of business and corporations are legitimate. The capital is a coward thing. I mean, if you can't convince an investment committee or a board that this is a good place to invest, we haven't done our job, right? And what worries me about a lot of the policy making right now is that it's being done on a bilateral basis and then announced, and then industry is forced to react, and it often is negative. And in some respects, it may not be needing to be negative, but it's because it's a surprise, and all of a sudden you're like, holy mackerel, my whole foundational element of how I've built my business and what I think I'm doing in the future has changed, and you haven't been involved in that discussion. And I think I'm sure that's how Indigenous people have felt for far too long. And so it's, I get the irony of, as a business person sitting up here and complaining about this, but the reality is that it's just simple communication and engagement, which leads to confidence in decision making. And I don't think that's been done very well in recent years.
Crystal, I want to put something to you because you and I have had this discussion before. There is a little bit of a perception. People look at it right now and go, oh, so First Nations want to own everything, or they want to have an investment place in all projects. What's the reality?
I mean, the reality is that some of our communities are ready. Some of our communities are in the driver's seat, and some aren't. Some have different focuses. And, since I've been away from the leadership table, I've had more of an opportunity to have more candid conversations in terms of where some Indigenous communities are at and where some corporations are at. And there's always that perception that when you're going to go and start a new project, that the community wants equity. And the fact of the matter is that isn't a reality. In Indigenous communities, we've been managing our territories for years. And we may have different focuses in terms of where our economic focus is and the capacity is. And some communities may just want a regular impact benefit agreement. They may want to participate in the regulatory process. It's ultimately where Indigenous communities are at, where their focus is, and if they have the capacity to be able to determine that.
Well, that's an interesting point. Do they have the capacity? So if you read the summary of the Haisla decision going back to 2004, it states in there that there are First Nations that do not have the financial resources or the personnel resources to be able to take on these projects. And so there's a question that has come in that says, what financing mechanisms, and we see some of them on the larger level coming from the federal government, but what financial mechanisms could enhance Indigenous participation and leadership in BC's economy? Yeah, I'll come right back to you. And Dallas, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think similar to what we've done on the conservation side, we built these endowments to help with protected areas and manage them and keep Canada's 30 by 30 biodiversity commitments. But at the same time we've done all that conservation, we haven't built any houses. We haven't created any new economic drivers that are there. So I think the loan guarantee program is a real good step in the right direction where there's access to capital, but I'd like to see some more outside of the box thinking about how do we use the First Nations Bank of Canada as an example for more of a lending pool or socially responsible investments in actual economic development as opposed to just socially responsible investments in conservation. And I think that's something we're teetering with. I think we're bringing in the people who've been down this road a little bit. I talked about the breadcrumbs. We're talking to the people who've actually dropped those breadcrumbs now, as opposed to consultants and other sort of hired guns that have sort of directed traffic. We got people who have actually been down some of these roads who are giving advice to decision makers now.
Crystal.
I think at one point our nation was in that place of not having the capacity or the human capital to be able to be focusing in on this, and we were very fortunate to have the creative mindset of problem solving at our tables. So working with industry, working with government, we were able to key in on having those funds generated to our nation to be able to provide that that expertise that came back to our nation. So through impact benefit agreement capacity funds, we were able to negotiate 3 positions that would work for the nation. With the proponents on the projects, that provided an opportunity for us to actually have one of our environmental leads go and get her master's degree in environmental science, and she's Haisla. That allowed for that capacity and that opportunity of employment of somebody going and getting their education to come back and work for the nation. She's been with us for about 10 years, and it's absolutely tremendous to see that one position flourishing. But there are creative opportunities that you have within your first discussions. And let's be mindful when we're thinking about leadership capacity. Chief councillors and elected council members are responsible for everything under the sun. Everything. I used as an example yesterday that, somebody's light bulb's not working. Who do you think they call? Right? In community. That's the reality of our leadership. You're not calling a premier, or you're not calling a minister because your light bulb's not working. But that's our reality. And then we have to manage all the social stuff, the suicides, the poverty levels in our community. But we're also trying to manage a lot of this economic development. And, we're learning and we're developing that capacity. We need to find creative ways to be able to help move that along. And one creative way is through capacity funding in initial stages of projects.
Glen?
Well, I couldn't agree more. One of I won't say which First Nation I was at, but fairly recently I was at a First Nation, and I was talking to the manager. Said he took me back into his office and he showed me this table filled with binders, and he said, "This is all required consultation." And then he said to me, "I spend half my day looking for a preschool teacher. I don't even have time to read this stuff." And so it's a really good lesson. Personally, I think revenue sharing is a key. I think the province should be sharing revenue on the land base with First Nations as part of a capacity building exercise. And I would, this is paternalistic, but I would not just give the money. I would give the money for capacity building. Like, there has to be real partnership where resource revenue is shared with First Nations so that they can build capacity to take over more and more of the responsibility. Because I do think that is the reality on the ground. Crystal made it better than me and knows more than I do, but it really, really depends on the First Nation. There's lots of very small First Nations that are impoverished that literally don't have the capacity, for consultation. And so we have to find a way to do that. And I do think that's a big role for business and for governments to really look at driving revenue in a way that can lead to more revenue down the road.
JP?
Yeah, for folks that know me, I'm a big governance guy. I really enjoy getting into governance, and I've chaired large Indigenous corporations that are owned by the community. And I think DevCorps, and it's been brought up here, are really critical, again, to the advancement of councils and, just not across the board, but certainly they have obviously a lot of say and way that projects get through community because they're the governments. And it's the same thing with BC Hydro as a Crown Corp. The province isn't going to make the business decision. It's going to be the Crown Corp. And it's a very similar situation in our communities where if we have good governance with our development corporations, they take the stress and the burden off of leaderships that are looking for the school teacher so that they can manage the business relationship. Now, that's easy to say, and it does not work that way across the country. But certainly it is one mechanism that our communities look to, and like I said, it doesn't always work. It's an example just to stay in a safe place with my First Nation, and we have a DevCorp shared responsibility between 4 of our First Nations that work together in the Lake Nipigon area, and it's beautiful. Equal share, equal risk. And I'll tell you, as one community really struggles, there's a couple of communities that do okay. And our First Nation happens to be the First Nation that does a lot of the work, but we're doing it for the benefit of all of our communities. And so sharing our human capital through those types of structures can help improve the long-term success, the solid pathways to get to FIDs as an example. But I'm looking at Crystal. I know she's probably got some thoughts on this too. I said it's a really beautiful model when it works. It doesn't always work. So
to wrap up, the theme for today was investing in British Columbia in partnership with First Nations. And is it a positive? Are we moving in a direction where we're becoming more attractive? Or do we still have work to be done? And I'd like to go down the panel and ask you, what's something that you want our viewers, listeners, people in the audience to take away to think about where we're at as an attractive investment opportunity? And I want to end with you, Mark, because you have an international perspective. Mike, I'll start with you.
Well, I just want to echo that. I think the thematics that have been brought here, the opportunity is extraordinary. I think it's evidenced by what's actually happening. These aren't theoretical. I think 10 or 15 years ago there were people talking about these ideas, but now it's actually happening, and you don't have to look far for the case studies of what is working. I think I'll just go back to what I said earlier. I think as a province, I think as a country, I think we really need to step up our game. I feel like we're playing community pond hockey sometimes in the area of investment and investment attractiveness, and we need to step it up. And if we do that and we tell our story through Mark and others that are on this and get out there and be purposeful about it and thoughtful and sophisticated, I think the opportunity is absolutely extraordinary for us.
Crystal.
I think one thing that I definitely want to leave with the audience is the fact that we are willing, we are capable. Given the resources that we've been provided, the knowledge that we have of our territories, we are experts. But I think the key message that I have is for Indigenous communities, in the sense of seeing this as an opportunity. Our people deserve an opportunity for an improved quality of life, and for centuries, we've never been able to find and navigate that through any, and I apologize to any level of government, but the expectation of holding government accountable to be able to improve the quality of lives of our people has not worked for years. And where I'm seeing the change in my community is through economic development, and that was a purposeful decision to participate. Our Indigenous communities, our Indigenous leaders, we need to provide better for our people, and it's through economic development that we find those opportunities.
I couldn't agree more, Crystal. And if I kind of pick up on something Glen said earlier around this important for this tri-party group to come in the past, it's been government, paternalistic, we know best for you. Industry, well, we'll make the soup and we'll tell you to eat it when we're done and let us know what it tastes like. In First Nations going, blockading everything because there's no trust. Like, that's the old. Like, the new now has to be a table that's reset with mind shifts, where government comes. These are governments as well. They have to be at the table to make sure that the projects that are happening in their territories are conducive to their way of life and to improve their community citizens for the future. Industry comes to the table looking at Indigenous nations as our partners. These are our equity partners that are going to help drive the success. And our First Nation leadership have to come to the table with open minds as well. To Crystal's point, like, we have to think differently coming to the table. We have to, and it's hard when you've been mistreated for centuries. It's hard to come to the table. I've eaten a green apple how many times and it's sour. Is this one going to taste good? I don't know, but I'm going to take a bite. I'm going to invest, and I'm going to keep an open mind heart. So we've got to come with a whole different mind shift, or we're not going to get this done.
Dallas.
Yeah, I really think it comes down to the balance. If you can trust us to conserve what's important, you have to trust us to develop what's important and needed for the economy as well. And that comes back to the human well-being that Crystal was talking about. It's only plagiarism in college. There's so many success stories that have evolutionary tracks that can be duplicated. And so I'd really like to see more work done on what's successful and breaking it down to common denominators. There's certain things that we share, and then there's certain things that we don't. And if we figure out where the common denominators are, we can focus on where the progress needs to be and isolate where some of the challenges are. We talked about the overlap question. The overlap question is only a big one if you're not talking about what you're trying to do in that shared territory or overlap. So you really got to focus these discussions, and First Nations need to continue to take that growing capacity and be more accountable to take control of the wheel and drive that bus.
Glen.
Are we making progress? Yes. There's lots of momentum. I feel quite good about it. I think we really have an opportunity here. I would say I don't think we're quite optimistic enough. This panel's good for that. I mean, we need more optimism. I had a mining company come in, and I started complaining about British Columbia, how hard it was to do business. And he said, have you ever tried to build a mine in the Congo? I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
Like, we sometimes sell ourselves short. These are challenges. There's issues. It's not easy to get to a final investment decision in anywhere, in any of these big projects. But we have a real opportunity, and we're making progress. And we have First Nations as partners, and we have a huge, I think, drive from federal and provincial governments for the first time I've seen in a long time to really try to drive our economic development through our natural resources. So I think we need to be more optimistic, and we need to build on the momentum that's there with First Nations and with governments. And I think if we do that, boy, we got a terrific future in British Columbia.
Mark.
Just to wrap up, I think the First Nations, the entrepreneurs, the business leaders need to get out there and tell their story, because it's such a positive story and such a difference than what's gone on in the past. And Canada is at it's a hinge moment. It's a pivot. People haven't heard a lot about Canada over the past 10 years. And now that Canada is open for business again, led with and in partnership with the Indigenous people, it's a great story that says, you know what? It's going to be easier to do business in Canada now than it ever has been.
I want to close on two thoughts. One was a conversation that I had with Chief Perry Bellegarde when he was the leader of the Assembly of First Nations of Canada. He said, yeah, it's not going to be a straight line. It will be challenging. There will be people who will get their knees skinned and their knuckles bashed a little bit. He said, what's the alternative? The alternative is that you leave unbelievable potential locked up within the Canadian society. We have to move forward, even if it's a little bit challenging. And then in a conversation that I had with Chief Joe Dion from the Frog Lake Nation, he said, First Nations, you have to realize, hold the key to the Canadian economy. They are the ones who can unlock it and move it forward. And I think that our panel reinforces that today. So I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you for those who have joined us in person and those who have joined us online. I think you're right, Glen. We need to be more optimistic about where the future can go, knowing that we will have some stumbles along the way. But when we have a collective will, that we can get there. So just before signing off, I want to make sure that the panelists know that you get to take home your coveted Conversations Live mug, and there is a gift certificate and corkscrew for you to say thank you very much from Marquee Wine. So thank you to everybody, and we'll see you next month when we take a look at what BC's innovation economy has to offer. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into Conversations Live, an Oh Boy Productions program. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find our previous and upcoming episodes at conversationslive.ca. You can also follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Again, thank you. I'm Stuart McNish.